In the next few sections, we'll be talking about the fundamentals of websites and also some basics of object-oriented programming. So in order to do that, we're going to need to have what's called an IDE, which means Integrated Development Environment, which is just an application that allows us to create website files or write programs. Visual Studio from Microsoft is one of the most popular IDEs for programming in the world. You can see I'm here at visualstudio.com/downloads, and they have a series of blocks here, one of which includes Visual Studio Community 2017. And this is free to use for students, open source, and individual developers who are not working in what Microsoft calls an enterprise. And if you click on Compare Visual Studio Editions down here, you can see that they define an enterprise as greater than 250 PCs or greater than $1 million in annual revenue. So we're going to go ahead and click on this free download button, and you see that it pops up a downloader here for 1.2 megabytes. And in the instructions, it's telling us we will run the installer, and we'll pick one or two workloads, either .NET Core cross-platform development or desktop development with C++. We're going to choose the first one with C# and Visual Basic. So I will save this to my local hard drive in case I need to rerun it. And I usually put my installers in my C drive in an installers directory. I'll create a new directory called Visual Studio and save the installer in there. I'll click this Open Folder button to pop that folder open and double click to run the installer. Click on Run, approve any user account control dialogs that pop up. Click on Continue. Notice it's downloading 67 megabytes. Goes through an installer process. Takes a few minutes to configure some things. And it pops up this window that allows us to choose our workloads just like it told us. I'm just going to select .NET Development and then scroll down here in the right-hand side and also select SQL Server Express 2016 so we can get our hands on some databases. You can change the installation directory if you want to, but I'll just go ahead and click on Install. Notice it's 3.5 gigabytes. The installer does some work. Once the installer finishes up, we've got this Start After Installation checkbox checked, so it will launch the application. The first thing it presents to us when it does launch is the ability to create a Visual Studio account. So you're going to want to click on Sign Up if you don't already have that. This is a typical Microsoft Live account. I've already got an account, so I'll sign in, and I'll click on Next. It asks for a password, and then we sign in. It does a little work to get things ready. And one of the first things is which development settings do you want? And inside that dropdown, it's JavaScript or Visual Basic, web development. I'm just going to leave this as general for now because we can come back and change this later. There are several themes you can use, light or dark. I personally prefer blue, so I'll click on Start Visual Studio. The first thing it shows us is a Get Started page, and it's got some links here that will show you how to build your first app in 5 minutes and maximize your productivity. I don't usually use this page, so I'll go ahead and close it. So at a very high level, that leaves us with this solution window open, which is eventually going to show us the folders and files in our project. And then there's this Server Explorer over here that's going to allow us to connect to databases when we're ready to do that in a future section. And then there's this toolbox over here that's dynamically going to show different kinds of tools depending upon what kind of file we have open. So in the next lecture, I'll show you how to create a very simple website project and view it in the browser. In the next section, I'm going to walk you through several different technological foundations that will help you have a better understanding of how websites are created and give you more confidence when you're trying to automate them and having to make choices about which selectors or locators to use to get reliable results. That section was originally recorded for a different course using a different tool called PyCharm. Despite the fact that I'm using a different tool, the HTML and CSS concepts I'm going to demonstrate apply to any website using any tool. So what I'd like to do in this lecture is show you how I can use Microsoft Visual Studio to create an HTML file, because you'll be able to follow along with the next section just as easily using Microsoft Visual Studio, even though in the videos I'm using a tool called PyCharm. To create a new HTML page, you can simply go to the File menu, hover over New, and select File. From the installed list, click on General, and notice we've got HTML page right there. HTML stands for Hypertext markup language, which is simply a tag-based language that's used to create almost any website you'll ever interact with. And it's important to understand the basics of HTML and CSS so you're more confident automating any website in the future. I can either double-click on this entry or click Open, and it created a new file for me called htmlpage2.html. This has not been saved yet, so if I type Ctrl+S on my keyboard, notice it's trying to send me into this deep directory here of C users Brian source repos. You're welcome to use that if you want, but again, my convention is to go into my C drive in a development directory. And for most programming stuff, I'm going to be using this VS directory, which stands for Visual Studio. But for this simple HTML demo, I'll just click on New Folder and type HTML, hit Return, and return again to go inside that folder. And to create the notion of a project, I'll create New Folder once more and type in HTML-demo to represent the project I'm working on. Hit Return, and return once more to go inside there. And now down here at the bottom, I have an opportunity to rename my file. Since many websites use the term index to identify the first page of the website, I'll use that here. And you could use either index.htm or index.html. Either one will work. In the next section, you'll see me using index.htm, but again, either option is fine. So I click on Save, and now notice in the window here, my file name has changed to index.html, and when I hover over it, I can see the full path, C development, HTML, HTML demo, index.html. Visual Studio is kind enough to give us a template of what an HTML document looks like. This is the HTML syntax, and if you're new to this, it may look a little confusing right now, but again, in the next section, I'm going to break this down piece by piece. Just so you have a demo of how to view this web page, I'm going to click in here between these two greater than less than symbols and type in my web page title, because you can see that this is a title tag and this is the name that I'm giving my web page. So the viewer will be able to see that title. Here between these two body tags is where the body of the web page will go. So for the sake of demo, I'll just type in this is the body of the website and use Ctrl+S to save. This is now a web page that you can open in a browser and view, and there's two ways we can do that. We can either use the View menu and go to Other Windows and select Web Browser, which as you can see on the keyboard would be Ctrl-Alt-R. So if I either select that menu or I use Ctrl-Alt-R on my keyboard, notice it opens a second tab here with a web browser, but it's pointing at this Microsoft Start page. What I would usually do would be to click and drag this tab back over to the left, so my source is now on the left side and the browser window is on the right, and you can toggle between them easily. Then what I would do is hover over this tab at the top and right-click and select Copy Full Path. So that copied this full path here into the clipboard. So when I click on this tab, I can click in the URL area and use Ctrl-V to paste that full path in. So now when I hit return, the body of this web page down here is going to display the web page I created. So I hit return, and there it is. You can see that the title of my web page that I created here is actually showing in the title of this tab now. And the body that I added down here, this is the body of the website, is being displayed on the page. If I jump back here to index.html and add something like, this is the cool body of the website, you'll see an asterisk shows up here, which means it's not saved. So if I go over here and right-click and use refresh, notice nothing changes. If I again click back over here, use Ctrl+S to save, then jump back over here and right-click to refresh, now you can see that has reflected my changes. So always remember to save before you go try to preview. Another way to view the web page would be to go back here to index.html and right-click on the tab and select Open Containing Folder. So now that opens up a Windows Explorer folder to the path where you saved your file. And notice per the previous lectures that I'm viewing this in details mode, so I can see information about this file. Notice it's only 1 kilobyte in size. To open it, I can simply right-click on it and use this Open With command And notice if I have multiple web browsers installed, I can choose to open this with Firefox or Google Chrome or Internet Explorer or even Microsoft Edge. And in the next section, you'll see me opening web pages in different browsers using the PyCharm IDE and hovering over a little widget up here in the top right to easily open the web page. We can just as easily do that, like I said, by right-clicking on this file and using Open With and selecting whatever browser we want to. So if I select Chrome, we see the web page we're working on, including the title and the body, right in the Chrome browser. And one more thing I'll show you before I go. In the next section, you'll see me right-click to inspect certain elements on the page so we can see what's going on behind the scenes. If you try to do that from within the Visual Studio browser, when you right-click, you don't have the ability to inspect these elements. You can use View Source, which takes you back to the source file, but you don't have the ability to right-click and inspect the element and have it show up in a little panel down here at the bottom. Whereas if we're using Chrome, if I right-click on this element, I can say Inspect, and you can see that it pops up this pane down at the bottom showing the various elements of our source and allowing us to hover over the page and examine any particular element on the page so we can learn about ways to automate it. So if you do want to follow along with all the examples in the next section, feel free to right-click on your source file, select Open Containing Folder, and right-click and select Open With to view your files this way. Obviously, the quickest and easiest way to interact with your file is to toggle back and forth between these two tabs, and when you want to preview your changes, simply right-click and select Refresh. So there's a lot of great information coming up in that next section that will give you a solid foundation and more confidence about how web pages are built to set you up for automating them with any tool, including UiPath, Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, and so on. Now that we've seen how to use the Visual Studio IDE to create and view a simple web page, let's do the same thing for a desktop application so you can get a sense of the power you can obtain by leveling up your tech skills. So I've got Visual Studio open here. I'm going to close the Start page and use File, New, Project. And there are two different languages we can use for building desktop applications. We could use Visual C#, which is definitely the more popular and enterprise-level way to do things. Or we could use Visual Basic, which has slightly easier syntax, without semicolons and things like that. Since many of the popular RPA tools are geared towards business people who might not have advanced tech skills, many of those tools are using Visual Basic syntax instead of C#. So while I might touch on some C# towards the end of the course, I'm going to focus mostly on Visual Basic. So as you can see, I've clicked on the Visual Basic node, and if you expand this, you can see that we have options like Windows Desktop or .NET Standard. Those are just filters. We don't need to mess with those. When you click on Visual Basic itself, you get the entire menu of choices. At some point, we're going to build a console app, and we're also going to build a class library. For now, though, let's see how we can build a desktop application using Windows Forms. So I've selected that. I'll rename it as My Desktop App. And normally Visual Studio will prompt you to save it in a long, deep file path. So you're welcome to do that. But if you'd like to follow my convention of using C Development, VS, you could click on this Browse button, click on your C drive, go into the development directory, and create VS or Visual Studio, whatever you want. Double click on that, and then use this Select Folder button to specify that you want your project to go into that path. So I click Select Folder, and you can see that's where the project will be stored. The solution name is automatically renamed to match the name up here, and I usually select this checkbox for Create a Directory for the solution. We do have the ability to choose which version of the .NET framework we'd like to use, but that's more of an advanced topic, so we'll just leave it as the default. When I click on OK, it builds me a project and shows me this Form 1 window. And over here on the right side, I've got a solution, which is simply a container for all my files. And whenever I click on something, similar to the way UiPath works, I've got properties for anything I click on over here, and we can change those to different values. Finally, like I mentioned before, I've got this toolbox over here, and that's got all these menus over here with controls that I can drag and drop onto my window, or a data directory here if I want to show things like grids, which is kind of like a table. I've got containers if I want to group things together visually. And we'll cover some of those in more detail in future lectures. For now, what I'm going to do is make sure that I rename this to something other than Form 1, because that's a little bit generic. So I make sure that I click on the window, and I go over here into my properties, and I scroll through my properties until I find Form 1 in this name field here. You'll also find Form 1 somewhere else under text. And I'm going to change both of these for different reasons. This design name is going to be the name that your programming code can use to interact with this window. So on this one, I'm not going to use any spaces. I'll just call it My Desktop App, no spaces. And when I click away, notice this still says Form 1, but if I scroll up here and look in my solution, this used to say Form 1, now it says My Desktop App. So I'll slide back through my properties over here and rename the text to My Cool App. And when I click away, now notice that the title of my window reflects what I entered in this text property. And even with these simple changes now, I've got an application that I can run and look at. So if I click on this Start button up here, notice it does some building of the application, and then it launches the application. So I've got this desktop window that could be minimized or maximized or closed, and notice it has that title, My Cool App. We could even change this icon up here in the top left if we want to. There's nothing in this window, so let's add a couple of things. I'll close the app, and we're back into Visual Studio. To make our app do something, we need to go into the toolbox over here. When I click on Toolbox and I expand Common Controls, I have things like labels and buttons that I could take advantage of. So I'm going to click and drag a label out here, and much like I did with my app window, when I click on this label, I've got a text property and I also have a name property. Again, this name property is what your programming code is going to use to interact with this label. So I'm going to rename this as Hello Label, because my goal is to write the word hello into this label. I don't have to use the word hello here. I could use output label or say something label, whatever we want. So to keep things clear, I'll just use this as output label. When I click over here, notice label 1 is still there because I didn't change the text of the label. So if I click on that and scroll up here, I just want to show you that that can be changed. And I'll just type in here, we will replace this. And now when I click away, my label's default text has changed to match what I type here. So if I run the app, we will in fact see the label sitting in the middle of the window. So that's cool. Close up the app, and I'll use my toolbox again to drag a button onto the window. And you're going to start to see a pattern here. My button also has text, and I'll just say click to say hello. And of course that gets cut off, so I can click and use these dots to resize the button. So when I again click on this button and scroll down to find my name field, by default it's called button 1. But let's change that to say hello. Now that doesn't change anything out here on the window, but it's going to make it easier for us to write code because we know what the name of this button is, and the name is relevant to a goal that we're trying to accomplish. So if I run the app again, I've still got my label, and now I have a button that changes when I hover over it. When I click on it, nothing happens. So let's go fix that. Programming with Visual Studio is really easy. All I need to do is double click on this button, and you can see it automatically opened a second file that has my programming code. And it automatically created this subroutine, which is kind of like a UiPath activity that allows us to do something. And the subroutine is handling the click event of the Say Hello button. So this is the name of my subroutine, and over here on the right, you can see that it's going to handle the click event of my Say Hello button. And what are we going to do? Notice Visual Studio automatically indents this text, so all I have to do is type in the name of my label because that's what I want to change. I'll start typing output, and notice the IntelliSense automatically recognizes, hey, he wants to change that output label, right? So if I hit tab, it pre-fills that for me. And now since output label is an object, and we'll talk more about that later, I can just use the dot. And that exposes some methods and properties I can use to interact with my output label. I'll talk more about this in future lectures, but I know that I want the text property of my label. And you can see that's being highlighted in IntelliSense, so I can hit Tab, and then I'll use space equals space, and I'll open my double quotes, which also closes my double quotes for me, and I'll type in hello from Visual Studio. So to summarize, inside my desktop app form, when somebody clicks on the Say Hello button, we are going to set the output label's text to hello from Visual Studio. So let's run this and see what happens. I've got my app window. There's my default text. When I click on the Say Hello button, there we go. We've just created our first desktop application that does something. So hopefully this gets you excited about where we're heading with our new tech skills. In future lectures, we'll see how to build slightly more sophisticated applications to help UiPath get things done, but we'll also investigate how UiPath could automate this app for us by clicking on the buttons that we created. Pretty cool, right? Before I end this lecture, I want to show you one more cool thing about building our own apps. When I go back into Visual Studio, you can see I've got a choice to build and run either a debug version of my application or a release version. In the UiPath Level 1 course, I talk about what it means to debug UiPath robots. We can do the same thing here in Visual Studio if we have this set to debug. But if we want to create a release version of our application, which is going to be used by others, we would simply click on Release, and then in the Build menu, we can use Build Solution to create the application. It gives us a status down here in this window. It tells us Build 1 succeeded, nothing failed. And it tells us where it was built. It was built in the C Development VS My Desktop App Solution folder. It's in a bin directory, in a release directory, and it's called mydesktop-app.exe. So we can actually go into our C Development VS My Desktop App directory and drill into the solution folder in this bin directory, in the release directory, and there you go. There's your application. And it's only 14 kilobytes, which is pretty small. So I will right-click and copy this and minimize everything and just go ahead and paste it right here in my desktop. So now I've got this application we built, and if I double-click on it, it runs just like any other application you might use. I can click on my button, and it says hello. So you can see how having tech skills and being able to use Visual Studio gives us lots of power to be able to create web pages or desktop applications and so on. So let's move deeper into the course and increase our tech skills.